John Odrich. I'll be talking about Robert Marcellus and his clarinets. I begin on a personal note. At the age of 7, I began studying the cello. My father is a cellist. And when I was 11, I decided to switch to the clarinet. After having started clarinet lessons with Salamato, a close family friend, a virtuosic flutist and a marvelous doubler, I began formal study with Mr. James Abato and Buddy DeFranco. During the Korean War years in 1950, I joined the Airmen of Note, a continuation of the old Glenn Miller Air Force Band in Washington, D.C. Mr. Abato referred me to Robert Marcellus, the principal clarinetist in the National Symphony. He had shared a locker with Bob at one of the radio stations in New York and was very impressed by him. Evidently, Bob was getting started in studio work in New York at a very early age. He had to have been quite young, since at the age of 17, Bob was already playing second clarinet in the National Symphony, where Iggy Gennusa was principal. So in 1950, I contacted him, started lessons, and began a lifelong expedition into the world of classical clarinetting. Bob was a wonderful teacher, a sharp diagnostician, and a truly virtuosic clarinetist. He became a close friend. At my very first lesson, I was given a list of recordings of outstanding orchestral performances featuring clarinet solos that my new teacher described as some of symphonic composers' most profound utterances. Those are Bob's words. It was an inspired assignment. This was my introduction to the great world of classical music and beautiful clarinet sounds. I quickly acquired the recommended recordings featuring Daniel Bonade, Ralph McLane, young Robert McGuinness, and Louis DeSantis. I listened, and those sounds became my siren songs to be stalked for a lifetime. Bob's Cleveland sound was the ultimate goal. As a result, the original objective to play jazz with my best clarinet sound soon morphed into embracing the world of classical clarinet, thanks to Bob's efforts. My lessons turned out to be cordial visits. He was living with his mother in a charming townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia, just over the bridge from D.C., a quick drive from Bolling Air Force Base, near where I lived. Bob had left the Air Force Band at Bolling 1 year before I arrived, and he had become the principal with the National Symphony Orchestra. My lessons took place at around 10 in the morning and ended when we had lunch prepared by his mother. It was just wonderful to be accepted into his family while away from home, and to have it in combination with a level of camaraderie and expert instruction I was fortunate to receive. It made my lessons a weekly joy. Bob would occasionally have to leave early for rehearsals, and I would have lunch and some interesting conversations with his gracious mother, who would tell me about Bob as a young boy, as only a proud mother would. She recalled how Bobby, as a youngster, would go off to school carting his bassoon case, which she laughed was almost as big as he was. It was endearing and intriguing to know that young Bob at one point was interested in the bassoon. There were many such stories and details about Bob and his family background. I learned that his father was deceased, had spent his life in the diplomatic service, and I got the impression that the family spent some time in New York when the UN was in Lake Success, Long Island, after World War II. Now, that may have been how young Bob began working in New York radio studios. After all, anyone who was able to stun Bonade by nailing all of the 16 Jean-Jean etudes in 2 consecutive lessons was certainly capable of performing in the studios, no matter the age. Small wonder that the accomplished Mr. Abato was impressed. Those special lunches and the history of Bob's younger years established a familiarity and warmth with the family past that I could not otherwise have had. The lunches with all 3 of us present were also delightful and included discussions about improvising and the role of vibrato in jazz and classical playing. There was a bit of golf thrown in during those 3 delightful years. I also attended concerts at Constitution Hall and got many chances to hear Bob's symphonic sound live. It had a resonant and beautifully burnished quality, truly unique. I'm going to address Bob's development and try to give some insight into his choices of equipment and the story of his journey in becoming one of the most outstanding masters in the history of symphonic clarinet performance, as a virtuosic performer and also as an inspiring teacher. We'll mainly cover his development from the years in D.C. and the National Symphony to the Cleveland years in the Zell Orchestra and a bit beyond at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. You know, Bob willed all of his clarinets and equipment to me, and I'm truly honored to have them. Here we have some of the equipment that Bob used during his 20 years as principal clarinetist in the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. This group includes Morré reeds, a Kaspar mouthpiece, a Bonade ligature, and some Van Doren reeds, which I used to fix and sent to Bob later in life after he lost his sight. Morré reeds were no longer available, but Bob continued to teach and conduct his yearly master classes at Northwestern in Evanston. I was part of the staff of Bob's yearly master class, along with Clark Brody, Kathy Jones, Greg Smith, and others, all superb clarinetists. It was fascinating to have had the opportunity to witness Bob's growth as a teacher and performer over the 46-year period of our friendship. Hearing him play in the 1950s with the National Symphony, then with the Cleveland Orchestra in Carnegie Hall in New York, and again as a teacher at Northwestern, it was really spectacular. He was unusual in that he played often for his students and always sounded wonderful and inspiring. Once, when demonstrating his concept of playing between the notes, that was his phrase, he received a spontaneous standing ovation from the participants in the masterclass. He had simply played a slow C major legato scale from low E to high E above the staff and back down again. His sound and beautiful connection of each note, both of which were the signatures for his famous legato, were astounding. Listen to his solo in the entr'acte number 3, and the feeling that each note is propelling into the next gives the impression of singing the melody. Absolutely beautiful. Beautiful. That is a perfect example of how a clarinet can sing a lovely melody with great elegance and beauty. These days, darkness in the clarinet sound is much sought after. Bob incorporated that quality and included a singing resonance that established a new level for a beautiful, beautiful symphonic sound. Clarinetists who have heard this sound in person will testify to how unforgettable it is. It is truly a siren song. The background to the changes in equipment he made in transition from DC to Cleveland is interesting. What we see are the various mouthpieces Bob used in the professional years of his playing. The Melior mouthpieces were Daniel Bonade's design and were to be used with Melior or the old Bonade reeds. All us Bonade students had to play that equipment. Many of us Many of us preferred otherwise, but made sure we showed up for our lessons with the correct Bonade setup. I had 10 of those mouthpieces at one point, but I could never get one to work for me. I had tried Bob's while I was studying with him from 50 to 53. It was great. According to Bob, he had 1 in 100. I tried a lot of them and finally realized it was more like 1 in 1,000, if that. After he won the audition for the Zell Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, he changed his mouthpiece. The change in mouthpiece, however, came about by accident, and literally by accident. It happened in D.C. before the move to Cleveland. The summer before Bob left D.C. for Cleveland, he was offered a good-paying job in the pit of a Broadway show on tour in one of the theaters in Washington. The chair called for an excellent clarinetist, which made Bob the perfect choice. The part, however, also required some alto sax playing. I was charged with finding an instrument for him. I contacted my father, who was a studio musician in New York, and he brought down a Selmer cigar cutter, model alto, a mouthpiece, and reeds. We spent one Saturday afternoon introducing Bob to the saxophone. Despite his strong dislike of saxophones, he was a very fast study and quickly sounded just fine. Doubling in the pit for a Broadway show often calls for split-second changes from sax to clarinet. And in one of those moments, his clarinet fell to the floor. The Melior mouthpiece was shattered. It was a terrible, terrible moment. Bob was always clear about the fact that his Melior mouthpiece was uniquely exceptional. The setup he had auditioned for Zell no longer existed, and Bob understandably was quite upset. Anthony Gigliotti, the principal clarinetist in the Philadelphia Orchestra, heard of the problem and gave Bob one of his best Kaspar mouthpieces. Now, only a clarinetist can appreciate the degree of kindness and camaraderie expressed in the generosity of such a gift. By the time he left D.C., Bob had already converted to the new setup and began moving in the very successful direction that would result in producing his famous symphonic clarinet sound. The new equipment helped his ability to develop a distinctly personal pear-shaped tone, adding a resonance and a way of playing between the notes, as he described the technique of his legato. All of this was new and something quite different from his playing in the National Symphony years, which was beautiful, but different. Now, the Mozart A clarinet. Here we see the Buffet A clarinet and Kaspar mouthpiece, with which he recorded his quintessential performance of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto with the Zell Cleveland Orchestra. I'm reminded of the first time I heard it played. It was in 1962, some years after I had left the Air Force, and Bob had been in Cleveland for 9 years. I had relocated to New York, and at Bob's recommendation was studying with his teacher, Daniel Bonade. Now, while I was driving home late one night from playing a club date in New Jersey, the radio announcer on WQXR introduced a new recording by Zell and the Cleveland Orchestra, featuring Mr. Robert Marcellus, playing the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. After the long introduction, I heard Bob's entrance with a beautifully shaped new clarinet sound. I pulled over to the side of the road, parked, and turned up the volume. It was thrilling. I was soon lost on the beauty of his playing well into the first movement when suddenly I was surprised by the flashing red lights of a police car as it pulled up alongside me. The patrolman motioned me to lower my window. I immediately complied, but before he could say a word, I jacked up the volume even more and shouted, "Listen to this, it's the most beautiful clarinet sound you'll ever hear. He's my teacher, Bob Marcellus. It's a brand new recording and it's spectacular. Just listen to this clarinet sound." I really did that. He took a long skeptical look and asked if I was really okay. I assured him, yeah, I was okay. It took several attempts. He finally left, shaking his head in disbelief. I stayed to listen to the entire recording. It was an unforgettable introduction to Bob's new sound using the equipment we are now looking at. It was a very different sound from the earlier equipment he used in DC while I was studying with him from 50 to 53. That was using Bonade's Meilleur mouthpiece and Meilleur reeds, as I said. Bob's changed to a combination of the Morré reeds with their thick bark and the Kaspar mouthpieces were essential in ultimately creating his unique orchestral sound with added beauty to the bottom of his tone. As I mentioned, that change actually began in DC before he left for Cleveland and was an unexpected tipping point. The new equipment and sound also became an important factor in his teaching. Bob's Cleveland tone was that burnished resonance that he had with a newly shaped warmth on the bottom of the sound that was unique and I think set a new standard for symphonic clarinet tonal production. It was quite different from his Washington, D.C. sound. Now let's examine the clarinets. We are fortunate to have the multi-talented master craftsman Tomoji Hirakata. He has worked with the Marcellus instruments and will point out some of the interesting technical features, the Mozart A clarinet and the B-flat clarinet. Tomoji is responsible for creating this video.
Hello, I am Tomoji Hirakata and I work at the Yamaha Artist Services in New York City. When I first examined those Robert Marcellus clarinets, I immediately noticed the excellent clarinet design apparent in both instruments. B-flat serial number is 95430. The production year would be 1967 and A clarinet has 45451. A good friend of mine and the Buffet Woodwind product specialist manager, Matt Vance, told me that the serial number lists during that era are lost and missing. And his educated guess of this A clarinet production year is around 1953. Matt also pointed out that because of that production year, it would be considered pre-R13. You can confirm this by checking the G sharp and A keys on the upper joint, he said. Pre-R13 meaning this clarinet does not have polycylindrical bore. I must mention that the buffet clarinets from this era have short key posts, lower key positions, meaning that all keys are sitting closer to the body, so your fingers and the keys travel minimum distance to cover. I've heard from a few artists that you can play better legato with this keyboard design. Needle springs are much harder and stiffer, but with the very short spring cradle, you will not feel the heavy key action. Flat springs are also stronger, but very thin. Overall, it's a remarkable clarinet design and both are beautifully manufactured instruments. Not to mention the fantastic customization I have found on Mr. Marcellus' A clarinet, which were most definitely done by Hans Menick, the world-renowned woodwind master craftsman and repairer. You will feel every key tone hole under your fingers so positively. Sliver keys are small and perfectly positioned so that you are less likely to accidentally hit them. Key action is fast each way with well-balanced spring tension, not too strong, not too weak. It's a minimalist clarinet. Special thanks to Dr. Ron for keeping them in very good condition. Both clarinets are still playing remarkably well. I have heard several surprising feedbacks from top artists. Hats off to master technician, Mr. Menick. I would like to share a few other unique discoveries I made on the A clarinet. The register tube measured 12.81 mm. That's much shorter than the regular R13 with a smaller bore on top and bottom. This customization may improve the undertone, grunts, in the clarion register and overall timbre, response and pitch in the upper register. The left-hand EB chimney, index finger tone hole, has a very large undercut and it has a plastic insert from the top. This insert work is meticulously done and that plastic piece is blended so well to the tone hole. It looked perfectly normal from outside. I couldn't recognize the insert and the large undercut until I started measuring. I would assume this modification does improve the 12th and has a good effect on the 3rd and the 5th partials. The DA tone hole has slanted undercutting. I don't think this is an imperfection, but I believe it is meant to fix the 12th and improve the timbre. The left-hand thumb tube. I found this beautiful old-style multi-threaded tube has two tapers, bigger outside and smallest inside. It also twisted counterclockwise. I've learned that this is one of Mr. Manning's famous tweaks. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Ron Odrich for letting me examine and repair these amazing instruments. I have learned so much.
Thank you, Tomoji. I must mention that several years ago, Morré had kindly resuscitated the A clarinet back to playing shape and had also expressed appreciation of its uniqueness. Speaking of experts analyzing the clarinets, there was a game that the technically virtuosic Hans Meinig used to play with Bob whenever it was time for a new clarinet. Meinig would collect a bevy of new buffet clarinets, inspect and test them carefully. I actually had witnessed his testing technique on one of my visits to his shop in Philadelphia. And I remember that he nailed the daylights out of a C dominant 7 arpeggio as a favorite lick, occasionally flicking off a quick 9th high D to the B flat above the staff. Not easy. He really sounded particularly good. He would pick out 3 fine clarinets that had the best wood, construction, and sound from those finalists and choose the one he guessed Bob would select. He wrote down the serial number of the winner and hid it in his drawer. Bob told me about his game and reported that after he tried all 3 clarinets and had chosen his favorite, Meinig would triumphantly reach into his drawer and show Bob the serial number of the clarinet he had chosen for him. Bob reported that Meinig had a perfect batting average. There was always a well-thought-out program for the selections that Bob made. He used the German-cut Morré reeds and chose the perfect combination of the Kaspar mouthpiece, appropriate for a particular performance. He generally worked with either a Cicero Kaspar 11 or Chicago Kaspar 13 as his favorites. Using this setup, he created a unique center in his sound that was both resonant and beautiful. The extraordinary experience I have in playing these instruments now is knowing that those beautiful sounds made by the original owner were produced on this very equipment. For example, one is tempted to search for a way to ferret out the secret way to create that stunningly original clarinet sound from the Zell Schubert Octet recording featuring Bob, including even resorting to old Morré reeds. It leads the player to think it's in there somewhere and makes for a lot of fun on the endless odyssey in search of legato nirvana. As a result, even coming close is thrilling, but one soon realizes that as remarkable as the equipment may be, and this equipment certainly is, the original player, with all of his inherent aural variables uniquely applied, is the key. There's nothing new there. Apropos of the Schubert Octet, I had given a tape of the Zell performance featuring Bob with an augmented string section to my friend Lenny Bernstein prior to its being considered for release. He loved it and he wanted to record it using that instrumentation. He urged me to work with Bob to get it released. The result was a very interesting phone call with Bob, but it was ultimately released years later, quite apart from the call. As time went on, medical and related dental problems began to be an issue. As a type 1 diabetic, in addition to diabetic retinopathy, Bob was prone to periodontal problems, which ultimately, sadly, meant an upper full denture was necessary. There were adjustments that had to be made, but he always kept his original equipment as home base and continued to successfully perform at the level we associate with his legendary recordings and performances. There were periods of experimentation as the years went by. There was even a period when Bob tried a double lip embouchure, soon abandoned. Then there was the glass mouthpiece trial that Zell himself was not terribly pleased with. As always, there was a carefully thought out method to deal with the consistent production of the best possible sound. Some changes in dentition can be seen in the photograph. The photographs of Bob as a high school student with a full complement of teeth and the changes as the years passed. Adjustment in embouchure Well, they were necessary as he adapted to a new oral structure. The resulting use of a new set of facial and oral muscles can be seen as older Bob adjusts to more stabilizing lip positions, especially pulling down the medialis at the corners of the mouth and pulling back and down with his upper lip. Changes that actually had a salutary effect on the timbre of his sound. These were all changes necessary to stabilize the upper denture and are visible as seen in the photographs. Unseen are the major adjustments in tongue position, which were also needed. It was necessary to reprogram and coordinate the 4 intrinsic and 4 extrinsic muscles of the tongue. It's not an easy task. Despite all of these difficulties, he managed to thrive rather than survive and continued with the beautiful clarinet performances for which he was famous. Clearly, Bob was very gifted. He also had an unusual sense of humor, best demonstrated by the following, told to me by one of the Cleveland Orchestra musicians. During a break in rehearsal at Severance Hall, Bob was returning to his chair with some of the musicians already on stage. As he walked through the French horn section, he casually picked up a French horn left on one of the chairs, put it to his lips, and blasted out the signature solo from Teutolenspiegel. He then carefully replaced the horn and with great aplomb and a straight face, casually continued on his way to his chair, to the amused amazement of his colleagues. Like most highly intelligent people, Bob had a sharp sense of humor. The B-flat clarinet is every bit as exceptional as the Mozart A. The 95-430 serial number places it in the period that coincides with Karl Marx's cornering the market on that series of R13 buffets. It is likely that Bob got the clarinet from his close friend Karl Marx. Now, Karl had studied with Bonade and later with Bob and owned a music store in Farrell, a small town in western Pennsylvania. He became a close friend of Bob's and imported a Morré reeds along with buffet clarinets. Bob told me more than once that one could not produce his sound with any other reeds. But you know, when he was forced to use Van Doren's in demonstrations for the master classes I participated in, he actually sounded as great as ever. The clarinet itself has a unique quality that invites a lovely connection of notes that somehow facilitates the legato. I had it undiscovered for several years after Marion, Bob's wife, sent me the entire group of all of Bob's equipment. When I finally opened the case, I was delighted to find this instrument in fine playing condition. I've been playing this B-flat with the Cicero Kaspar 11 mouthpiece and have found the combination works perfectly for me, but with my wonderful ligature reeds. Now that would certainly get a rise out of my friend Bob. But I like to think that if he could hear the results, he just might agree with me. He may even possibly tolerate the vibrato. I know. That's wishful thinking. I'm sorry, Bob. Now, there was Bob the bon vivant. Bob enjoyed drinking and smoking his favorite Cuban cigars, the secret source for which he shared with me. This rare photograph was sent to me by Denny Nygren, one of Bob's students and a fine clarinetist. Here is young Bob while on tour in Europe with the Cleveland Orchestra. Note the stein of beer in his right hand and the cigar in his left hand. Knowing him as well as I did long before the revered maestro emerged, I appreciated his human qualities, but was often moved to try to convince him that perhaps it would be in his best interest to taper those indulgences a bit, given his medical issues. It became one source of conflict between us. The other source was so silly I'll keep it to myself. The concern I had and felt was based on our close friendship and how well I knew him for so long. It did not diminish the respect and camaraderie we shared. In conclusion, I must agree with something that was pointed out by Bill Hudgens, the great principal clarinetist of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. In a recent interview with friend Ed Cioffi on Ed's website, Bill noted that we all revel in the lineage of clarinet masters from Hyacinthe Clauzet to Cyril Rose, to Henri Lefebvre, to Daniel Bonade. They represent a long chain of extraordinary talents who have created a legendary fount of information that is an invaluable basis for all clarinetists. We can now add the legacy of Robert Marcellus to that list. It is a privilege to have been associated with Bob and his teacher, Mr. Daniel Bonade, and to be able to share this heritage with my fellow clarinetists. My thanks go to Tomoji Hirakata for the creation of this video and for his masterful craftsmanship and knowledge. A special thanks to my dear friend Ed Cioffi for urging me on for 3 years to, in quotes, get this done already. So there you have it. Thanks, Ed. And thank you all for listening.